Washington?
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting time in D.C. We just got out of this period where there were 3 major scandals. Several of them have dissipated, and I think right now we're just waiting to see what will happen on the legislative front with immigration reform and budget talks. So we're in a holding pattern right now.
Sam Stein, Huffington Post, political editor, White House correspondent. Thank you so much. We leave you now with Washington Journal and go to the House floor. Have a good day.
We give you thanks for giving us another day. As this House comes together at the end of the week, bless the work of its members. Give them strength, fortitude, and patience. Fill their hearts with charity, their minds with understanding, their wills with courage to do the right thing for all of America. The work they have is difficult work. May they rise together to accomplish what is best for our great nation and indeed for all the world. For you have blessed us with many graces and given us the responsibility of being a light on shining on a hill. May all that is done this day be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined the Journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the Journal stands approved. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 1, Rule 1, I demand a vote on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal.
Questions on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal? Those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The Journal stands approved. The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I object to the vote on the grounds that a quorum is not present and make the point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. Pledge of allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Chair will entertain up to 5 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to advise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, this week our civilian defense employees are at their desks working fervently after staying home for their first furlough day last week. Now they're having to take a furlough day each week for the next 11 weeks. And I've talked with folks in my district who are, to say the least, frustrated, and our nation and them are deeply, deeply affected by these furloughs. As one constituent said, they are being held hostage. The United States is the greatest nation in the world and has the greatest military the world has ever known because we have citizens dedicated to serve, dedicated in spite of a lack of true leadership in Washington. While the administration had other choices rather than to furlough these essential employees, they chose instead to make a political statement on the backs of our fellow citizens to spread the pain far and wide. Our nation's defense will undoubtedly suffer. I continue to urge the administration to utilize the flexibility it has and for Congress to get to work on our nation's defense legislation. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For purpose, the gentleman from Georgia rise. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to thank a longtime staffer member in my office, Brandon Webb. After more than 6 years of service to the people of Georgia's 12th District, Brandon left my office to serve as legislative director for Congresswoman Robin Kelly of Illinois. Brandon joined my staff in 2007 as a staff assistant and climbed through the ranks to serve as senior legislative assistant. Brandon played an important role in crafting legislation, including a bill to cut the federal vehicle fleet, saving the federal government over $500 million. And he helped our communities by organizing free health fairs for families in the 12th District to get the care they need. I'd like to congratulate Brandon on his promotion with Congresswoman Kelly, and also to congratulate him and his new bride, Sabrina, on their recent marriage. I'm honored to have had the privilege to work with Brandon, and on behalf of the people in Georgia he served for over 6 years, I'd like to thank him for his hard work and dedication. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For purpose, the gentleman from South Carolina rise.
Consent to address the House for 1 minute, advise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, our education system needs reform for America's children. For far too long, we have watched as government red tape and regulations have robbed our youth from the learning skills necessary to succeed. Children deserve better than ineffective status quo education practices. We must empower those who know what's best for our children, rather than continue the tradition of big government mandates. House Republicans, led by Education Chairman John Klein, have a plan to reform our education system with common-sense solutions. By removing the power of government bureaucracy and empowering locally elected school boards, our teachers, parents, and local leaders will have the opportunity to develop a working educational plan to help our children succeed. As the House votes on the Student Success Act today, it is my hope that members from both sides of the aisle will join together and support this legislation for the sake of our children's future. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we'll never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
The gentleman yields back for purpose. Gentleman from Vermont, rise.
To address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, climate change is real. The future damage that will be done if we fail to address it is foreseeable and predictable. We're living through an extended period of radical weather. In 2012 was the second most damaging weather systems in infliction of economic harm on this country in the history of our country. $115 billion. Much of it from Hurricane Sandy, much of it from an extended drought. Sea levels are rising. This is measurable. This is not debatable. It is fact. What we're doing in this Congress is arguing about energy policy, but we're having that argument in a context where we're denying that the failure to address climate change won't have serious economic and social implications. Sea levels are rising. The damage to our Treasury is rising. The suffering of our people is real. And it is absolutely essential that the House of Representatives acknowledge the reality of climate change and include that in its debate on energy policy. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, rise. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today I come to the floor to recognize 2 young heroes from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Last week, a young 5-year-old girl, Jocelyn Rojas, was abducted from her front yard by a stranger, an older man who turned out to be a previously convicted sex offender. The police and folks across the neighborhood quickly organized a search. Tamar Boggs and Chris Garcia set out on their bikes with other friends, and when the boys spotted a suspicious car wandering through their development, they checked it out and saw the young girl inside. They relentlessly chased the driver on their bikes for 15 furious minutes. Recognizing that the boys wouldn't give up, the man let Jocelyn out of the car and drove away. She immediately ran to the boys asking for her mother. They safely brought her back home, and while they may not think of themselves as heroes, they certainly are. Thanks to Tamar and Chris, Jocelyn is home, and the suspect is now in custody. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose, the gentlewoman from Illinois, rise. Without objection, so recognized.
I rise today to speak about the terrible fire earlier this week that destroyed much of the town of Prophetstown, Illinois, a small town in Whiteside County, Illinois, that I have the honor of representing. The blaze destroyed nearly all of downtown and disrupted the lives of so many people living and working in this northwestern Illinois town full of caring people. Several families of this town of more than 2,000 people lost all of their possessions, not to mention their livelihoods. Angie Stegmiller lost everything she owned in the fire, including precious knickknacks that were handed down from her grandparents. Her cats are still missing. But as Angie said, it's not the stuff, it's the memories behind the stuff. She's still holding hope that her cats will return. But the community's response to the fire should serve as an inspiration to all. Residents are coming together to help one another through this. The Methodist Church has received so many food donations that its freezers are overfilled. Neighbors are helping neighbors clean up the rubble and turning over spare bedrooms and bathrooms to those who are temporarily homeless. Residents have begun the slogan, Prophetstown Strong, to refer to the resiliency of this community. I have no doubt that due to the spirit and resolve of the citizens of Prophetstown, this town will recover and be stronger. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The lady's time has expired. For purpose, the gentleman from Michigan, rise.
I ask unanimous
consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we've had a few acrimonious weeks over the last month, but today I want to talk about something that crosses the partisan divide, something that makes this country go. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, it's undeniable that the ethic of hard work is the glue that binds our nation together. And when we go back and forth yelling at each other, we in Congress tend to forget that. Our task is to promote legislation that leads our country into the 21st century. As Congress prepares to take up some major issues, we must keep in mind that the people of this nation want solutions that empower them to achieve their American dream. We must remember what keeps this country together. We must strive valiantly and dare greatly, and we must develop solutions that promote hard work and an honest wage. Thank you. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. For purpose, the gentleman from Rhode Island rise.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, since taking control of the House of Representatives, House Republicans have held 39 separate votes that would undermine all or part of the Affordable Care Act. What's most unfortunate is that in those 2.5 years, the House Republican leadership has refused to work across the aisle with Democrats to put people back to work and pass a comprehensive jobs bill, a bill that will help middle-class families. It's time for the House Republican leadership to put away political slogans and partisan gamesmanship and get serious about governing. Let's focus on rebuilding the crumbling infrastructure of our country so we can move goods, services, and information to compete in the 21st century economy. Let's harness American innovation and support the resurgence of American manufacturing by taking up the Make It in America agenda of the Democratic caucus. And let's protect young people and families from rising interest rates on student loans. Mr. Speaker, let's stop wasting time and get America back to work. I yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. For purpose, the gentleman from Arizona rise.
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize a distinguished leader who has earned the respect of everyone who knows him, Mr. Tom Price. Tom has lived in the Kingman area for almost 30 years and is married to Alda Calderon Mora, and together they have 6 children and 4 grandsons. Tom is a successful attorney who is happy to advise anyone on their legal situation. He is a critical thinker, the kind of man who is able to take a complex situation, simplify it, put it into context that is usable, workable, and solvable. Tom has that gift. He serves on several boards in the community, but today I honor him for his service to the Kingman Chamber of Commerce. He has served in each of the executive officer positions within the Kingman Chamber of Commerce and is serving in his last years as immediate past chairman. He is the chairman of the Commerce, Business, and Government Committee, which concentrates on educating the community on political issues and candidates. Tom, thank you for your work and your dedication to our community. I truly believe the entire Kingman area is a better place to live in because of you. For a life that includes more than 30 years of service, I am pleased to recognize Tom Price today for his in this great body as a true American and a leader for the businessmen and women of Kingman, Arizona. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For purposes, the gentleman from California rise. Without objections, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to bring your attention to the development of an exciting new fabric that was recently created by the biomedical engineers at the University of California, Davis, a fabric that drives moisture away. 2 graduate students, Alex Singh and Jay Jang at the Micro Nano Innovations Laboratory, led by Professor Tingri Pan, with the financial support of the National Science Foundation, developed a textile that stays dry by forming moisture into droplets that drain away by attaching a network of water-attracting threads to water-repellent fabric. Now, discoveries like these have led to significant advances in a variety of applications. This project could be used to develop and improve active gear, but more significantly is likely to be developed in the materials that will help our firefighters and our troops stay cool while in the field, or help astronauts conserve precious liquids while in space. I'm proud to support federal funding for scientific research, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. To House Resolution 303 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole on the State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 5. Will the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, kindly resume the chair?
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 5, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to support state and local accountability for public education, protect state and local authority, inform parents of the performance of their children's schools, and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole House rose on Thursday, July 18, 2013, Amendment Number 21, printed in House Report 113-158, offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Brown, had been disposed of. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 22, printed in House Report 113-158. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 22, printed in House Report Number 113-158, offered by Mr. Culberson of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 303, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Culberson, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment will restore state sovereignty over public education and restore parental rights over the education of their children by restoring the state legislature's power to accept or reject federal education grant dollars. I've worked closely with the committee to ensure that this amendment supports the goals of local control and flexibility as promoted by H.R. 5, and I sincerely appreciate Chairman Klein's support of this important amendment, as well as his continued leadership to improve our nation's education system. State legislatures, Mr. Chairman, should have the ability to make an informed decision regarding federal grant dollars, just as a patient consents to a medical procedure after a doctor explains the risks and benefits. I'm grateful for RSC 10th Amendment Task Force Chairman Rob Bishop's support and co-authorship of legislation we filed in this regard, and the support of the National Taxpayers Union and the Council for Citizens Against Government Waste, because my amendment will actually ensure that if state legislatures reject the grant dollars, they will be dedicated to reducing the deficit and paying off our outstanding national debt. Finally, it should be noted the Congressional Budget Office indicates that my amendment will have no impact on direct spending. I want to thank Chairman Klein again for his support and urge my colleagues to support both my amendment and the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserved. What versus the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I oppose this amendment because it endangers education funding for sort of a political exercise here. This amendment would actually require state legislators to approve every single grant program from the Department of Education before states receive the money. So taking the authority from the local communities, the local education agencies, putting it back into the state malaise of legislative process. It's overly burdensome on states, creates a mountain of unnecessary paperwork, and delays students and schools from receiving the much-needed funding. And when the short-sighted state legislators may refuse that funding, then the amendment would take the money and send it back, returning it to the deficit as opposed to its intended use, which is the education of disadvantaged students. I sometimes wonder if my colleagues remember why the federal government is involved in education K-12 at all, and that is to address a shortage, a court-mandated addressing of shortage of attention to disadvantaged students. This is just another attempt by the majority to slash education funding. And, Mr. Speaker, it's not the time to play politics now. Now is the time to increase our investment in education and in our children so that we can be competitive and so that they can have an opportunity moving forward. This amendment is simply a distraction to the very real, very big problems that this entire bill, H.R. 5, has, and it lets students down. H.R. 5 guts education funding because it locks in that automatic cuts of sequestration. It does nothing to ensure students improve learning. It does nothing to make sure that they graduate from school. It lets students with disabilities be taught to a different, lower standard. And H.R. 5 blocks grant funds and forces states to give the money to private schools and for-profit companies instead of students. For these reasons, Mr. Chairman, I urge that the colleagues vote no on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd point out that the amendment, in fact, upholds our system of dual sovereignty and ensures local control over local dollars, and the legislatures will actually be able to conduct this vote as a part of their regular legislative proceedings during their annual budget vote. The amendment, as it says in the language itself,
The vote will be taken by the state legislatures as a part of their budget vote. This is a vote they take as a part of their regular legislative session, so it's no additional burden on the states. We're simply ensuring transparency and ensuring that the legislatures fully understand the implications of accepting the federal dollars. And those dollars that, for example, Texas rejects, we want to make sure go toward deficit reduction and paying down the national debt. It will be no additional burden on the states, and in fact this amendment will in fact reaffirm and restore our Constitution system of dual sovereignty, where the states retain a residuary and inviolable sovereignty over those issues that deal exclusively with the citizens of their own state. And I want to thank Chairman Klein again for his support and urge the members to adopt this amendment and the underlying bill.
Gentleman reserved.
And I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thanks, Chairman. Look, I just want to give a little historical perspective to this again. You know, the whole reason that the federal government is involved in K-12 education is because states weren't doing the job when it came to addressing disadvantaged students. There was a judicial mandate that said that states had to step up and do that. The states, were then problem by the fact how much that was going to cost. So the federal government stood forward and said, you can have some federal monies if you do the job. And so we've had that tension between flexibility of how they'll do the job and how we will hold them accountable for years. But this notion of saying that the state government will now decide whether or not local communities will accept the grant, and if they don't, we're not going to apply that money to actually educating those children that are disadvantaged. We're going to toss it back into the Treasury, is no other than a way of cutting education funding. We don't need education cuts at this point in time. We need an investment in education. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserved. Gentleman from Texas.
Actually, the money will continue to flow to the states as it does today. The state law already sets up a mechanism for the money to flow through the states to local school districts, so that money will continue to flow. And also, under the language of my amendment, the federal government has an unshakable obligation to ensure equal protection and due process. So that 14th Amendment obligation on the federal government is undiminished and is expressly reaffirmed in my amendment. So there will be no discrimination nor imposition on every American's right to equal protection and due process. And I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
No. Well, I don't want to beat a dead horse here. Simply the notion is that states that were already at fault for not having done the job now get to not do the job again as long as the state legislators are the ones that make the decision. It goes through. Your language doesn't make it quite as simple as to how they'll vote in the state legislature. It will be a delay if it's done at all. And if a state should make the unwise decision, as they had done historically, which gave the reason for us being involved at all in the first place at the federal level, then you're cutting education money. You're not applying it to the use of educating disadvantaged students. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserved. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I urge the House to adopt the amendment and support Chairman Klein's underlined bill and move passage.
Do you reserve?
And I reserve if the gentleman has no further comments. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Request to be recorded vote.
Gentleman requests. Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 23, printed in House Report 113-158. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
An amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 23, printed in House Report Number 113-158, offered by Mr. Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania.
Pursuant to House Resolution 303, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the chairman of our committee, Mr. Klein, for his important work on the Student Success Act. This amendment, Mr. Chairman, is designed to stop the abhorrent practice in America's schools known as passing the trash. Passing the trash is a term used to describe those cases where school administrators deceitfully move to other school districts teachers who are known or suspected of being sexual predators. The predator is allowed to resign their employment, often keep their teaching certificate, and move on to a new, unsuspecting school to continue their deplorable crimes. Sometimes they're moved with a recommendation of their previous employer. The matter of passing the trash was first brought to my attention in 2006 when I learned of the story of 12-year-old Jeremy Bell, who was drugged,
abused and then murdered by his elementary school principal. Jeremy Bell's principal had been passed between schools and school districts despite multiple allegations of sexual misconduct brought to the attention of school administrators and school boards. Sadly, Jeremy's story is not the only one of its kind. Reports show that nearly 10% of students are targets of educator sexual misconduct sometime during their school career. These predators must be stopped. This amendment would block state or local education agencies from receiving funds if they facilitate the transfer of an employee if they know or have probable cause to believe that the employee has engaged in sexual misconduct with a minor. Furthermore, the amendment would require the hiring of employees to be compliant with the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act background check requirements. Teachers play an important role and part in the development of our children, and in doing so, they shape the future of our nation. Many of us are here today thanks to the devotion of a teacher or teachers who saw the potential in us and took it upon themselves to go above and beyond in our education. We know that the overwhelming majority of educators are committed, caring individuals who are deeply invested in the development of their students. And because of this, we owe it to them to rid our schools of the bad actors. This amendment ensures that the days of sweeping child predators under the rug are over. By holding all educators to the very high standards set by their peers, we can ensure that quality education for all children will be a reality, while also doing everything we can to protect their innocence. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment and on the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the amendment number 8, offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. The essence of this provision is included in the Democratic substitute amendment that Mr. Miller is offering with the intent of protecting children's safety in all the schools throughout the country. Mr. Miller wants to thank the gentleman for joining the Democrats in this effort. Congressman Fitzpatrick's amendment would require all schools to conduct comprehensive background checks for all of their employees, including FBI fingerprint checks, state criminal records, child abuse registries, and the National Sex Offender Registry. The amendment also includes a critical provision that denies federal funds to schools from employing any individual who is found by these checks to be a potential danger to children. Schools would also lose federal funds if they transfer such employee to another school, which unfortunately happens too many times. Tragically, the abuse of students by trusted adults has become a regular occurrence. We read about students being abused in the headlines. Every child deserves a safe and abuse-free learning environment. That's why we include a similar provision in the Democratic substitute and why earlier this session Mr. Miller introduced a similar bill, the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act, H.R. 2083. That bill overwhelmingly passed the House in a bipartisan fashion just 2.5 years ago. Mr. Miller's bill and his amendment are stronger versions of Mr. Fitzpatrick's amendment because his provisions also cover school contractors and the checks also include any crime against a child, even if it's a misdemeanor. But this amendment is a step in the right direction. This amendment and these provisions are needed in federal law, Mr. Chairman, because according to a recent General Accountability Office study conducted by Mr. Miller's office, state laws are inconsistent in their coverage of the types of checks, types of crimes covered, and the individuals who must be checked. Some states only check licensed employees and some states don't check contractors, leading to some school districts unknowingly hiring offenders. Children in school need to be safe from any adult who has access to them regardless of their position. The GAO investigations also highlighted a wide range of cases in numerous states where convicted sex offenders working in schools had previously targeted children. In other cases, GAO found that districts knowingly passed a potential predator to another school district, allowing the offender to resign instead of reporting him. The inconsistencies and glaring holes in the way schools screen prospective employees lead to gaps in student protection and all too often to abuse. A child's safety in school is too important to leave to chance. We must ensure all children, regardless of where they live, are free from the abuse of violent sexual predators. There's no place for this in our nation's schools. The vast majority of school staff is trustworthy and work hard every day to support students' learning needs. We honor and respect their work, which is so central to the success of the nation. These criminal background checks are essential, however, to ensure that schools and school districts are doing everything they possibly can to protect children's safety. That's the most fundamental of our priorities. Mr. Chairman, again we want to thank Mr. Fitzpatrick and Mr. Meehan for offering this amendment and urge a yes vote. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for his support of the amendment and for his comments here this morning. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and to support the underlying bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 24, printed in House Report 113-158. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 24, printed in House Report number 113-158, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 303, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
I thank the chairman. Good morning, and I'm pleased to be on the floor with Mr. Tierney and the gentleman from California in their commitment and their comments on the question of the equality of education for at-risk children. I think if there's anything that comes out of this important discussion and from the chairman's presence on the floor, it should be that we should be focused in tunnel vision on the concern about at-risk children. And my amendment is a straightforward amendment. It is an amendment that gives information. Specifically, it calls for a study and a report containing recommendations regarding the advisability of authorizing a state education authority to close a school district over the opposition of locally elected school board, families, students, teachers, and calls for best practices governing the exercise of authority by a state education agency in monitoring, supervising, and controlling underperforming school districts with particular emphasis on rural and underserved districts and underserved communities. Our children are our precious resource, and I have been in schools and school districts where children love the atmosphere in which they are in. They clamor for the teachers. There is a mutual respect and coming together. And all they need is a focus of resources and improvement. But rather than getting that, authority is used to either undermine the funding of those school districts or, in essence, say to those school teachers and all of those who have been working and taxpayers that, in fact, this school will not be given dollars to improve. In the Center on Reinventing Public Education, assessed a number of states, and the interesting determination was that states spent less on improving school districts and schools, less on improving, but more on shutting them down or not allowing them to go forward in at-risk areas. This chart gives you the balance of distribution of performance and improvement, and many states, such as Texas, spend less than 5% on performance. So what does my amendment do? It provides balance between local control over schools and our state educational agencies by providing a report. It makes sure that taxpayers and locally elected officials are not ignored by the state. It also has a way of preventing communities from being blamed as a problem and engaging the community. It prevents poorly prepared state elected officials who've been placed in positions to run schools from taking money from those schools as opposed to investing in those schools. It makes sure that minor problems are fixed before you go to drastic concerns. It allows a determination of the structure of appeal so that the appeal is allowed broadly by those who are impacted, taxpayers, for example, who are very important. And it allows to determine whether the state authorities are giving the effective oversight over rural districts and at-risk districts. And then it provides the opportunity to ensure that there is a fair play and that we are interested in the quality of education. I ask my colleagues to support the amendment. I reserve my time.
The gentlewoman from Texas reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise? Minnesota rise, I apologize.
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment requires the Secretary of Education to conduct a study to examine underperforming school districts, whether equal educational opportunities are being afforded to students in those school districts, and the impact of closing these school districts. Mr. Chairman, as the amendment clearly states, this is a state activity in which the federal government has no role and should not be involved.
We do not need recommendations from the U.S. Department of Education on how states are to protect the constitutional rights of students. This is the law of the land today. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment and support the Student Success Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Minnesota yields back. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
Well, as we started, the reason why the federal government got engaged in education is because I remember times in the South and across America when there was unequal education, and we needed the U.S. Department of Education. More importantly, we needed the courts. Today I stand here and ask for a simple inquiry made by the U.S. Department of Education. Are state agencies effectively closing school districts and not seeking to improve them? A very fine example is the closure of the North Forest Independent School District in Houston, Texas. Solvent, 50,000 registered voters, 7,000 students had received awards, and what did the state agency do? The state agency came into the opposition of the community, teachers, supporters of a combined effort between a public school and charter school, proposed coming together to put forward the best proposal to keep this school teaching our children, the support by Republicans and Democrats, and an autocratic state agency closed the school district. So this is a simple inquiry. It is an inquiry as whether or not you want to boost up the taxpayers and boost up the parents that have no standing. It's a question of whether or not you want to make sure that there is a basis of a fair appeal as opposed to an autocratic process, a dictatorial process. I ask my colleagues, all of them have faced this. No one wants to interfere with the running of a school district or interfere with the administrators or educators, but what you do want to interfere with is business decisions closing rural school districts and closing urban school districts and not allowing the people, the teachers, to be able to understand and to give input into the best process, Mr. Chairman. I would argue, and I'd like to be able to refer to the Center on Reinventing Public Education, but I will argue in closing, Mr. Chairman, that this amendment gives opportunity. I ask you to support the Jackson Lee amendment.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose?
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The lady asked for a roll call.
I ask for a roll call vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 25, printed in House Report 113-158. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 25, printed in House Report Number 113-158, offered by Mr. Cantor of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 303, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Cantor, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, a good education is the first step in the long walk to living the American dream. That is what this amendment is about, Mr. Chairman. So I'd like to reserve my time.
Reserves. Does any member seek recognition?
In opposition.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment is not about a good education. This is an amendment suggesting an approach that, in fact, the amendment doesn't enable to happen. And that is the idea that a student can choose the school under the guise of portability when, in fact, it doesn't set up any mechanisms for the students to do that. The suggestion here somehow is that, in fact, that the students will make this choice, their parents will make this choice. We've had the right under No Child Left Behind for students to make the choice to elect to go to any schools in the district that they sought to do that. And of course, what we have found out is that in many instances, it's less than 2 or 3% of the parents make that decision. And they don't. The reason that many reasons why they don't do that is that in fact it's a decision that doesn't work for them. Because of lack of transportation in poor neighborhoods, the lack of issues of personal safety of their students, the difference in my district and some parts of my district of going to the school that's next to your home and walking the 6 or 8, 10 blocks to where the next school is a matter of personal safety for those children. We have children, unfortunately, who are harmed every day on our streets, in some cases killed on those streets. So for parents, this isn't just a choice that that's a better school. But also, under the Cantor Amendment, you would be requiring school districts to engage in an incredibly complex accounting system, and I don't know why we would burden them with that. We currently have in many districts open enrollment, and as I say, parents can choose that if they choose, but in many cases they can't because of barriers to that enrollment. So this is the suggestion somehow that you can just pick up and move your child. What we see in survey after survey after survey is what parents want is they want their neighborhood school, the school next to them, they want that school to be functioning at a high level so that their children can get an education at that school. I know that maybe the author of this amendment isn't familiar with these parents, but these parents are struggling between their jobs, their work, holding their families together, very often single or individual working women supporting these families. This is a difficult task. And the idea that the burden won't be on the district to improve that local school, but we'll just leave it be under the guise that parents can opt to send their children somewhere else when in fact that's not a real option for them. This amendment doesn't address either the concern about open enrollment, it doesn't address the systems that the states have set up, and it clearly doesn't address the needs of the parents, and it fails to recognize that in many school districts there's only one school, there's only one middle school, there's only 2 elementary schools. That's not the issue here. This isn't like a panoply of wide choices that are made available to that. That's why many of us have encouraged charter schools inside these districts so that parents will have that choice that is within reach of them. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Alabama, Ms. Roby.
The gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of Leader Cantor's amendment to H.R. 5, an amendment that would allow Title I dollars to actually follow the student to the school of their choice. And so I thank the leader for recognizing me. We all agree that every child deserves equal access to quality education, one that challenges them, builds critical thinking skills, and enhances their opportunity for success. But all too often, the system fails those who need it most. And for too long, we have perpetuated failure by not demanding accountability for results. This amendment would allow Title I dollars to follow the child to the school that their parent deems best. As a mother of a child in public school, I understand firsthand how important it is for parents to be able to choose the school that best fits their child's needs. And school choice can help drive innovation, healthy competition, and, most importantly, accountability. And if a low-income parent makes the brave and noble decision to seek a better opportunity for their child, the last thing that we should do here is make it more difficult by withholding funding meant to help educate that child. Mr. Chairman, we can't afford to do the same old thing expecting different results. I urge my colleagues to adopt this amendment and pass the Student Success Act. Let's get Washington out of the way to ensure a brighter future for our children. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from California reserves.
You want to speak on this?
Does the gentleman from California reserve?
I yield to the gentleman from Connecticut 1 minute.
The gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise in support of the Miller Substitute Amendment and in strong opposition to the underlying bill, which, as it is, drastically underfunds our education system and sets up our children and our nation to fail. Right now, the majority's bill freezes education funding through the end of the decade at just above the sequestration level in 2013. Compared to last year's level, this means a $570 million cut to education funding, one of our fundamental priorities as a nation for each of the next 5 years. Nor does this majority bill allow for annual increases due to inflation or enrollment growth. In effect, the majority is trying to lock in federal education spending at a level far below what is needed and then simply walking away from our schools and our kids. And keep in mind, all of these cuts come on top of several earlier rounds of deep cuts by the majority to education spending. Mr. Speaker, without access to quality education, there is no middle class. The compact is broken that allows hard work to pay off and allows future generations to do better. We cannot allow this to happen. I urge my colleagues to support the Miller substitute to this flawed bill.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My home state has been one of the leaders in the area of equitable funding for kids, so that whether you come from a wealthy mountain resort or the inner city of Salt Lake City or a West Desert rural ranching family, the same amount of money follows the kid to their schools in any situation. We did that simply because we care about kids and we established a fair system of dispersing the money. When we did the GI Bill, the money followed the GI. Only in Washington, here, with these particular funds, where the Department of Education does not have an equitable disposal mechanism, do we find this situation in which we treat kids differently. It appears to me that some of the outside groups that may be opposed to this are simply saying they like this antiquated disposal system, which means that some Title I schools get a whole lot of money and other Title I schools don't get very much money, if any at all, because we don't have an equitable system for dispersing our funds. We need to do what many states are doing right now and make sure that we have an equitable distribution system. This amendment moves us in that direction. I yield back.
The gentleman from Utah yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
How much time do I have?
The gentleman from California has 30 seconds.
Hey, there you go. On your mark. This amendment just doesn't address the realities of the current law. First of all, the underlying bill takes away the choice the parents have today. This amendment wants to pretend like it's choice. When the gentleman from Utah says the money follows the child, no. In Utah, they have state equalization. It's the same amount of money wherever you go. No money follows you. The suggestion in the Cantor Amendment is that somehow this money will follow you, except that it requires states and districts to set up an entirely new bookkeeping system. These are people who say they don't want to burden those districts. The fact of the matter is, under current law, parents can choose to send their children to another school. Whether all of the money will follow them or not, under the Cantor Amendment, there's no mechanism and there's no money. There's no full entitlement to money. I know the gentleman wanted to have vouchers, and this is an imitation voucher, but it doesn't work. It simply doesn't work for a child, for the parents, or for the school districts.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the remaining time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, what I'd say to the gentleman from California, first of all, this is an amendment which provides states the option, if they want to allow this type of funding or flow of federal dollars. No one's forcing any state to do anything or any local school district. I'd also point out, Mr. Chairman, that I believe there are several cities, I think one in the gentleman's state in San Francisco, which actually have allowed for state dollars to follow the kids. So perhaps I think that there are, but I think...
from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But I think to the point that it's a bookkeeping difficulty, certainly there are localities, school districts who figured out that this can be easily done. And I want to follow up on the point that the gentleman from Utah has made. This is about how federal dollars currently are allocated under Title I. And in the school districts, once the school districts have the money, the way the federal requirement is now, there are some schools that receive a lot of Title I money, and there are others that could receive none, if very little, Title I money. But in fact, what this amendment is about is trying to provide all Title I kids with the resources that I think all of us want them to have. And again, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield when I'm finished. I'll yield to the gentleman.
I would just say the reason some schools don't have a lot of Title I money or some Title I money is they don't have Title I students. It follows the students to those schools.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, the state of the law is such that there is a requirement now that Title I monies at the local level go to schools with 75% or higher of population. It is the overpopulated, poorest schools that are in the law said to get the monies first. The problem is, what if your school doesn't quite make that cutoff? What if that population isn't quite at that benchmark? What about the Title I kids in those schools? That's what this is trying to address, Mr. Chairman. And so, again, too many of our underprivileged children today are finding themselves in schools that cannot address the problem. And this amendment is aimed at trying to restore those children and those parents' ability to have the quality of education that all of us want. And again, this amendment does so by granting the states the power, if they so choose, to allow Title I funds to follow the students. I believe the current system clearly is leaving some kids behind that exist in these schools that aren't getting any money. And the lack of access to quality schools and quality teachers will and can hold children back, and most especially those children living in poverty and those often with special needs who do require help. Many states are reforming their system to address these inequities and these shortcomings. And in fact, as I indicated earlier, there were some major school systems, and I know of one in the gentleman's state, that have actually tried to redirect state and local monies according to this spirit, which is allow every child to have equal access to funds and resources. But unfortunately, those states don't have the flexibility to match up federal funds with these type of reform efforts that are ongoing at the local and state level. Federal Title I funding was created to help the most vulnerable of our students, foster children, the homeless, those living below the poverty line. And this amendment will give states the option to allow Title I funds to allow each student to follow each student to the public school, including charter school of their choice. Again, right now, federal dollars do not follow all of the students that they're supposed to help. This amendment will make certain that no matter what school a low-income student attends, he or she will benefit from these dollars. And, Mr. Chairman, improving our education system is a bipartisan issue. And this amendment builds on the bipartisan work being done at the state level. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to this time just thank the leadership of the gentleman from Minnesota, the chairman of the Education and Workforce Committee, for his commitment to responding to the desires of all of our constituents who believe that education is the fundamental building block for all to achieve the American dream. And I salute him in his work and in his tenacity to try and get things right in the reforms that are necessary to allow for that promise to be realized by all of our kids. And I yield back. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 26, printed in House Report 113-158. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I yield. I have an amendment that's in the nature of substitute.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 26, printed in House Report number 113-158, offered by Mr. George Miller of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 303, the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller, and the member opposed will each control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself 5 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this debate highlights some of the stark choices about the direction of our education system. The Republican bill sends us backwards, letting students down at a critical time. This substitute amendment I'm offering will move the nation forward. Every day, schools are making great strides to take our education system into the 21st century. They are raising standards, trying new ways to boost learning, improving the skills of teachers and principals. Mr. Speaker, we in Congress should be a partner in these efforts, providing resources and the support to help them move forward, not gutting funding and walking away from our responsibility to help as the Republican bill does. Despite some good things in current law, No Child Left Behind's one-size-fits-all approach has hampered progress. It's time to revise the law, building on what we have learned over the past decade, spreading best practices to all schools, not just to some. The Democratic approach does this. It maintains our bedrock civil rights responsibilities. My amendment would help ensure that all students have access to a world-class education regardless of their background or zip code, and that teachers, principals, and schools have supports and resources to provide that education. Unlike the Republican bill, the Democratic amendment improves current law in several ways. We call upon states to set high expectations for students, ensuring every child graduates prepared for college or for a career. We eliminate the one-size-fits-all approach of accountability, called AYP, but we still call on schools to improve the student learning and graduation rates each year. We give districts and schools the flexibility to determine how to improve learning and graduation rates. We ensure teachers and principals get timely and useful feedback so they can improve their skills. We also ensure educators have good working conditions and positive supports to help them do their jobs even better than they do now. We provide robust funding for literacy, for STEM, for technology, and other subjects like art, music, to ensure that all students have a well-rounded education. And we provide resources and supports to ensure that students are safe, healthy, and free from bullying in schools so that they can focus on learning. The Republican bill does not come close to meeting any of these goals. In their effort to eliminate federal involvement in education, they let students down. They fail to ensure students improve their learning or graduate from high school. They fail to ensure that students with disabilities are taught to the same high standards as other students. They fail to provide adequate funding and resources for students and schools. They fail to move beyond the narrow focus of reading and math and to ensure that all students get a well-rounded education. If we can't pass a better bipartisan bill, No Child Left Behind will remain the law of the land, and this is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to the scores of organizations who oppose H.R. 5, from business to labor to civil rights to disability advocates to education organizations. And that's why so many groups support this substitute amendment. This fight is about equity. It's about every child in our country getting an education they deserve, regardless of poverty, disability, or other challenges. I urge my Democratic and Republican colleagues to support this Democratic substitute so that the students and their families have the education system they need to prepare for the future. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. For purpose of the gentleman from Minnesota rise.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
When No Child Left Behind was signed into law more than a decade ago, it was heralded as groundbreaking, and certainly in many ways it was. The expanded use of data helped superintendents, principals, and teachers pay more attention to the students with the greatest need. Parents now have more access to important information about the quality of teachers in schools, and some student achievement gaps have narrowed. However, hindsight is 20/20, and we can now clearly identify the law's weaknesses. The adequate yearly progress accountability metric is a one-size-fits-all mandate that fails to provide schools any meaningful information about their performance. The law's highly qualified teacher requirements value credentials over an educator's ability to motivate students in the classroom. Strict mandates and funding restrictions stunt the development of innovative local education programs. The Student Success Act will correct the mistakes of the past and provide states and school districts the flexibility they need to put more children on the path to a brighter future. Flexibility, Mr. Chairman, I might say, has been begged for, demanded, year after year since this law passed. Superintendent after superintendent and principal after principal has said to me, I don't need money here, but I've got it. I need the money over here and I can't spend it. If I just had more flexibility,
we could take care of making sure that all these kids get the education that they deserve. The substitute offered by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle simply continues the same failed policies we're seeking to correct and encourages greater federal intrusion in classrooms. No matter what you call it, AYP or any other rigid federal accountability system is still the wrong approach. Replacing the existing law's 100% proficiency target with a menu of equally unrealistic goals is not the answer. Enshrining the unprecedented control over schools assumed by the Obama administration, rather than supporting the innovation occurring at the state and local level, is not the answer. This substitute also fails to meaningfully consolidate programs or give states and school districts greater freedom to use federal funds. It includes outrageous and unrealistic authorization levels that Congress and administration will never come close to meeting. I welcome meaningful contributions from my colleagues across the aisle, but a substitute that doubles down on the status quo is not what students, parents, or educators deserve. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment and support the underlying bill that will empower the nation's parents, teachers, principals, and school administrators to deliver the educational system our students need, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Minnesota reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Are you one in